Welcome back to React Native Radio Podcast. This episode brought to you by Reactatron. Google it. Episode 180, Testing Strategies, Tools, and Frameworks.
Hey everyone, welcome to React Native Radio Podcast, where we explore React Native together. I'm your host, Jamin Holmgren. I'm joined, as usual, by my co-host, Aditi Ravichandran. Hey, Aditi, how's it going?
Hey, doing well, Jamin.
Awesome. And we also have Harris Robin Kalash. Harris, you're in a different spot again. How are you doing today?
Hey, Jamin, I'm good. Hello from Ottawa.
Ottawa. Every time people talk about Ottawa, they just talk about how cold it is over there. Is it pretty cold there?
Yeah, and it's like boring. It's just politics. It's like DC, I guess. It would be the equivalent.
Yeah, I'll stay very far from DC this time of year. And then also my co-host, Robin Heinz. Robin is not in Ottawa or Washington, DC. How are you, Robin?
I'm doing good, Jamin.
Good. I'm very excited about this topic. There's a lot to talk about. But before we do that, I want to mention that this episode is sponsored by Infinite Red. Infinite Red is a premier React Native design and development agency located in the USA and a little bit of Canada. With 5 years of React Native experience and deep roots in the React Native community, we are the hosts of Chain React, the conference, and we also publish the React Native newsletter to over 11,000 subscribers. If you're not one of them, go to reactnativenewsletter.com. Infinite Red is the best choice for your next React Native app. How did I do with that reading? I didn't just make it up off the top of my head this time.
That was really good. That was a good elevator pitch. Yeah, it was good.
Good. I stole it from Jed. I think Jed wrote it originally. Jed Bartowski, our project manager.
Shout out to Jed.
So our topic today is going to be testing strategies, tools, and frameworks. And there's a ton to go over here. I mean, we have so much to talk about. I gotta admit, I didn't do as much show prep this time, but to be honest with the topic, it's one of those things where we live it every day. So I feel like there's just...
Everybody does it, but nobody talks about it. So let's talk about it.
Right, exactly. So let's just go ahead and launch into this. I think that first off, we have to just talk about, just for really basic understanding, testing, of course, is where we write software that tests our software, the software that we write. It's turtles all the way down, software all the way down.
In terms of JavaScript, it's functions all the way down.
Functions all the way down to the bottom. And it's also something that I didn't necessarily take seriously through probably the first half of my career because, I wrote software. I would test it manually. It worked. Like, what was the big deal? Like, why write more software? That seems like it would just slow you down. But then I started doing Ruby on Rails, and in Ruby on Rails, Ruby in general, there's more of a culture of writing tests. There's sort of a large contingent of people that believe in TDD, test-driven development. There's also another contingent that believe in behavior-driven development, which is kind of similar. There's sort of outside-in tests versus inside-out tests. So that sort of led me to this idea that testing is a good idea. And I've seen it for myself as well, where tests have helped me kind of be more confident in the software that I'm writing. So, but we're talking tests in the context of React Native. And React Native is a very unique environment for writing tests because we're not necessarily JavaScript, we're not necessarily native, we're both. We have both things going on. So it's not as maybe straightforward as it would be, in a web environment or in a Node environment or Ruby on Rails. So that's why I think this topic can be such a complex topic for us React Native developers.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely less obvious with React Native. I think one particular challenge is with end-to-end testing. So that tends to be pretty challenging because if you're testing the user interactions, you have to test on both platforms. You can't run. It's not like on the browser where you could just run Selenium, run a Chrome instance and be pretty confident about it. So there's also, on top of that, there's also different patterns on each platform. So even if you do test user interactions, it might not be the exact same interaction on iOS or Android. So
right, that kind of in a way goes back to our previous episode where we talked about the differences and the challenges between iOS and Android when we're talking about the two platforms. So we sort of have a dichotomy there between the two platforms. Then we also have the JavaScript layer versus the native layer. And that can be very, difficult to do. So traditionally in mobile app development, native mobile app development, generally people use Appium as their way to do integration testing. And the integration testing, or sometimes called functional testing, is where people go in, basically is where you write tests that simulate user interactions. So loading up the app completely, like you literally build the whole app, load it up, have them tap on the login input, put in an email address, put in a password, tap login. It goes in, and then you actually tap around. And as you're doing this, you're also measuring and checking for labels or buttons or text on the screen to see, is this what we expect to see at this time? And it can be very, very helpful, these types of integration tests, because what they do is they test so many things. So many things have to go right in order to log in.
Mm-hmm.
It's a smoke test. It's a way to, if smoke comes out, if you see an error, then something's wrong. Let's stop and let's look at it. And then dive in more detail at that point and figure out what's going on. But you really just want it to run in the background as you're doing something else, or, taking a break or something, and come back and say, if everything passed, I don't need to go check everything. It probably worked. So let's keep moving.
What would you say the difference is between Appium tests and detox tests? Because in my head, they're kind of the same thing.
Right. From my standpoint, they do fill very similar functions within the testing world. You probably wouldn't use both, although there is a case for using both that we can get to. Most of the time, though, you're going to choose one or the other. Detox. So Detox is by Wix. The excellent engineering team over there at Wix has created Detox, and they actually built it because they weren't very satisfied with what Appium brought to the table. They were not happy with how Appium was kind of flaky. They didn't like how it was essentially Appium is a black box testing thing. So it basically just looks from the outside and says, I'm going to push this button, and then every once in a while I'm going to look at this, spot, and I'm going to see what happens. And eventually, something is supposed to happen. Eventually it'll be like, okay, yeah, that worked, and we can move on. But because it's a black box, it doesn't know what's happening under the hood, and it can't really predict when things are going to finish. Like it'll tap a button and then it just has a timer that checks every so often. So black box is nice because it's that's what a real user would do. They don't know how the code is working under the hood. But sometimes it leads to spurious failures in your tests. And this can lead to flakiness, which is very frustrating as a developer. Oh, my Appium test just failed. What happened? You rerun them, they pass. That just is very frustrating.
Mm-hmm. I think that's where Detox definitely helps out. I think that's what you're trying to talk about. Where I have never used Appium, but to some extent, the flakiness that people complain about is probably eliminated in Detox testing because they have a slightly different principle, I guess. They're kind of gray box testing
exactly,
opposed to black box.
I think it might be worth just describing what black box testing and gray box testing is for viewers who might not know. I don't know.
Yeah, I would love it if you would do that.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah.
Don't mind me. I'm going to Google this in the background.
Right.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I recently Googled it. So, black box testing is essentially it's a test environment where you don't actually know the internals of the application. So, as you mentioned, Jamin, it's really good in the sense that that's an actual user. They don't know the internals of it. So it's that's why it's called black box, because you can't see in the box, right? Gray box testing is in between. So it's a mix of black box testing and what we call white box testing, which is white box testing is if you're a developer, you fully understand the internals of the application and you're testing it as a developer. So gray box testing is in between, where we know some of the internals, but we still want to test it as an end user.
Maybe we should also kind of to back up and let our listeners, clarify what are the different types of testing as well, because we're talking about end-to-end tests right now, but they're just,
Right.
different types. So we have like unit tests, we have service level tests, and we have like the end-to-end tests that we were talking about, detox and APM. And unit tests are probably the most written one. You would write like thousands of unit tests for an application, ideally. And these are basically testing a single piece of your functionality or a function. It's like testing, let's say, a function. You test an isolated method, and you would do plenty of these. And then there are these service level tests, which are basically testing code that have dependencies, where you would test like...
It's like API services.
Exactly, yeah. You would test APIs or component tests. And these are usually slower than the unit tests. And you would write maybe like little less than the unit tests. And then you finally have the end-to-end tests like detox, which is basically testing the full flow of your application, where you're testing it like it would emulate how a user tests the application. And you would write fewer of those tests.
So it's sort of I think Martin Fowler calls it a pyramid, or the pyramid of testing, or something like that. So there's fewer of the integration ones and more of the unit ones, and then kind of in between. Now, why wouldn't you just write one type? Like, why wouldn't you just write unit tests? Why do you need to write the other layers?
I think we're doing that to kind of create a balanced portfolio of automation testing. That way we capture not just, for instance, if you just had unit tests, every unit works correctly, but when you put them all together, it may collapse. So the idea is to make sure your entire flow is working as well as every single unit works. I think that's kind of the idea there. Because if you just had one layer, you may miss out. And it's basically to make your software less error prone and higher quality.
Yeah, it reminds me of a tweet I saw, I think an image where it said unit tests pass, and it shows two drawers in a kitchen cabinet in a corner. And when you pull one out, you can't open the other one.
Yeah.
Both drawers work,
Right.
but then the interaction between the two.
Do they work together? Yeah.
Exactly. Do they work together? Now, once you know that something works, like at a unit level, why would it ever not work in the future? Like, why would you need to write a test that runs it every time rather than just testing it manually once and then being like, okay, it works, and move on?
Well, are you ever planning to change your software?
No.
Good point. If you're ever going to add new features or fix bugs, you want to be able to quickly make sure that nothing broke, which in the business is called regression testing.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
And as the scope, increases, you can't merely click through the application every single time you add like a component or a feature.
Yeah.
You need automated end-to-end tests that take care of it.
Yeah, it's going through and clicking things for you and checking things for you. Now, regression testing is a very interesting one. That's actually one of my favorite types of tests to write. So someone reports a bug on like our open source, and I go and actually write a test that replicates the bug first. So it's failing, like I can see the test failing. Then I fix it, and then it goes green, and then I can push up a pull request and commit it and know that in the future this isn't going to break again because we wrote a test around that particular scenario.
Yeah, it's a very satisfying type of test, right? You're like, one more thing that I can feel confident about.
Is it possible to over-test?
I don't think so.
Definitely.
I mean, it depends on what you're measuring against. I mean, if you're talking about a project with a limited budget or a limited time frame, there's going to be a level of testing that starts to not be worth your money or your time and doesn't add any more value. But in terms of like doing harm to your project, no, I don't think you can over-test.
I've never run across a situation where we ever over-tested. It's always almost just under-testing because, as Robin mentioned, we either have a budget constraint or a time constraint or just laziness, or we
testing is always the first thing
you scope
to get
out.
cut.
Yeah.
And
And we noticed that, oh, I know this probably works. It's just you feel overconfident and, cut it out. So it's never, I think we can have a goal to overtest, but that almost never happens.
It's sort of like saying, in theory, there is a point where you become too rich, but I haven't hit it yet.
Yeah.
I would actually throw a couple of scenarios in where maybe you could say that you overtest. One is where you're testing so much that any change causes a ripple effect of tests that you're having to change that becomes very burdensome, where like any change at all becomes very, very, it's like it's locking you in too much to a particular implementation. Mm-hmm. And I would actually then say that's a symptom of testing implementation details, probably.
Right.
Where you're testing things that don't really matter to the user, but you're testing things that matter to the developer. And now you go refactor and like it breaks everything. If you can refactor, like without changing the behavior to the user, if you can refactor and not break your tests and instead they're just helping you know when you're done, that's fantastic. And I think Kent C. Dodds talks about this all the time. He has a great website about testing React. And one of the things he talks about is like, if your tests are breaking on just a straight refactor where you're not changing behavior, then your tests are testing too many implementation details. And I would say that's over testing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you ever think there would be a scenario where you would write tests for the sake of the development process and then delete them?
I've done that. I actually have done that. Yes. But for the most part, those are pretty rare scenarios. I would say an example of that would probably be like a regular expression where I want to make sure that what I'm writing for the regular expression is doing what I want it to, but then it is a very kind of implementation focused thing. But even then, often I'm leaving it in the testing.
Usually, if I'm testing regular expressions, it's because I'm trying to like make sure that a function that's like parsing a list of things to try and find something that matches a particular regex. Like that's behavior. Like I want to make sure it's always returning the results that I expect based on like the search term I gave it or whatever. And I feel like that's valid. It helps you develop, but it also ensures that the behavior doesn't regress.
I would like to test more, but I feel like sort of the culture of, small companies or startups, they don't really accommodate for that. And you really have to think about the ROI of everything you do. So going back to what you said, Robin, about like limited project and budget, I think that's pretty much most of the time, unless like I feel like unless you work at like Facebook and you own this little piece, right, of the machine, then it makes sense to test a lot. But most of the time, like you don't really like. I feel like we don't really have the time or the budget for it, and we have to really get these high ROI tests. And I think that's kind of the benefit of Detox here. Is like it's the ROI is extremely high, right? So it's annoying to write sometimes. It's quite expensive, but.
And it's also visually you can see what's happening. So it's nice for like, if you didn't really have a QA, you can, Detox can play the role of the QA.
What do you mean by that, Aditi? How can you see what's happening?
So with tests like Detox or an equivalent, which is Cypress on web, you can see the user action. So it's all written. We write our code and we simulate a user action. So it looks like on our emulator, somebody's actually running a test. So you can see the user experience. And you can do that on a device too with React Native. It could either be an emulator or a device. So a lot of the times, if you have folks like, who are not really tech, but who are interested in this, application, who want to make sure it's working well, even your clients, you can show that, you can validate by just showing Detox tests running, and they'll be like, oh, cool, seems to be working. They've written a lot of tests, looks good. Whereas if you show them unit tests running on the screen, on your terminal, it just won't make much sense to a non-techie. It's kind of what I was talking about.
Yep. And Appium does something similar where you can watch what's going on.
I always found that really, really satisfying.
Right, yeah.
Running Detox and just like watching my simulator click through the app is
and
really
it does it
cool.
way faster than you could manually. It's super fast.
It's nice for demos too. It's like it's a cool way to like demo a feature.
That's very cool.
And I kind of relate to what Harris was saying as well, because I used to work for a larger company here in Kansas City, and back then we used to write lots and lots of tests, and we had plenty of time, plenty of resources, and projects wouldn't get released for like 8 to 10 months. So we would test and test and test, and we would have like dedicated developers just writing tests. So, and then I moved to a startup, and testing definitely took a back seat because we want to, quickly prototype a product and sell it. And yeah, it definitely makes a difference if you're working for like a huge corporate versus a small company.
Yeah.
Definitely.
What you were mentioning earlier, Robin, it's satisfying at first, but what I found with detox tests is that, the first time I see it, I'm like, oh, that's cool, but sometimes they're so slow and I end up turning them off, like, to be completely honest. It's just, some of these, I don't know why, but sometimes they just hang. Like, I'm not sure, like, what's going on, but, like, I'll write a detox test and I don't know what it's waiting on. Maybe there's a mistake in my code. I'm not sure. But sometimes these tests like will randomly time out. Like I still find detox a little flaky, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I've had tests time out. Like sometimes they resolve, but it takes like forever, like 20 seconds, and it's quite expensive.
If I could write end-to-end tests that were very fast, like way faster than they are right now, and not flaky at all, always deterministic, then I don't know if I would write too many unit tests. I think I would mostly just write end-to-end tests. But the problem with that is that FedEx guy has his radio up really loud. He just comes flying up and then...
I thought you live like in a super remote area, so you get FedEx shipments?
Yeah, we do. We also have internet and power.
Great. And running water.
Oh my god. USPS gets there too, right?
Yes, we do. When my mailbox is standing. So I'll actually tell you something funny, kind of, DT. So my wife, when we were looking for land, she was like, these are my criteria. I want it to be, I don't want to have really any neighbors to speak of. I want it to be kind of, she grew up on a farm.
Okay.
So she's like, I don't really want neighbors. We lived in a subdivision, neighborhood. So it was like very annoying. I want there to be some like privacy and, quiet and stuff like that. But I also don't want it to be more than like 10 minutes from shopping. And I'm like,
that's a
good
tall
luck.
order.
Right. Yeah. Like we're going to find that,
That's very inconsistent.
And
did you find it?
We found it.
Oh.
Like we totally found it. Like we are 8 minutes from a store, like a grocery store. Maybe like we're only about 25-minute drive from Portland if traffic is nice. And it was actually a piece of land that her dad owned.
Oh, cool.
Not very far from her farm. And so I bought it from her dad. He had owned it since 1970. So it was like, it was actually a lot. It was a struggle to get it buildable because it was, there's all kinds of
There was
things
like
wrong with it,
nothing,
but
pipes and...
No, yeah. Well, I mean, there's water, but not like sewer, and
must have been expensive.
It was expensive to get it all set up and ready to go, but he sold it to us for a decent price, and so we were able to kind of like afford that. And so it was that's a whole thing. But when my wife was like, I want it to be like, and we have one neighbor and it's her sister. And that's it. Like
we should get your wife on the podcast and talk about this someday, an episode.
We should.
She wouldn't come anywhere near
we should
it,
get Kyra to come on and talk about perspective as Jamin's wife. what her perspective of React Native is like.
Right. That'd be funny.
I should take her to visit India sometime. I live in a very populated city called Chennai. I think she would just faint.
She's been a lot more adventurous lately about stuff. We went to Bali, in Indonesia, and she like planned out all of the activities to explore the island and stuff. So she's totally been, she grew up on a farm. We literally haven't moved further than like 5 miles from where she grew up, but we've started to explore further away now, and that's been really cool.
Nice.
Anyway, we should probably...
What were we talking about when we stopped?
Jamin was saying something about...
if end-to-end tests were fast and stuff like that. So the problem is that end-to-end tests are not fast, and they are flaky, even with detox. So we don't have quite that experience that I would love. maybe in a few years, someone will come out with something and be like, hey, here's this like insanely fast, always 100% deterministic, like end-to-end test framework. And then we'll all go crazy for it and we'll have them on this podcast and everything. And this is an invitation to everybody listening. Go ahead and invent that, please.
On that note, I really like Cypress for web. It definitely kind of achieves that, I think. It's super fast. I don't see a lot of flakiness or anything. And, I've kind of reduced doing unit tests just because Cypress doesn't feel that expensive or anything. And
is it better than Selenium?
Way better. I don't know.
I've heard horror stories about Selenium.
Yeah, so Cypress is fast and Selenium has a lot of dependencies that you have to install. Even like setting up takes time. But with Cypress, I think it's all just super fast, easy, written in JavaScript, and, it's very intuitive and nice.
Mm-hmm.
It's promise-based as well, right?
Yes. Maybe they should do something for React Native as well. But they do just browsers, so yeah.
I complained on Twitter recently that it would be nice to have Cypress for React Native, but
did you really?
I did, yeah. But the thing is, it's such a hard problem because you are not dealing with a browser. You are dealing with, like native code and integrating it with this JavaScript engine in the middle of it, and this somewhat hostile environment to having things go in and changes and stuff.
Understandably hostile. I mean, like they're trying to protect the app from outside interference. But.
Exactly. Now, I feel like there's an opportunity for Expo to come in and say, okay, here's the Expo testing framework, and it works great and super fast and awesome.
Do they not have a Expo specific testing?
Not that I'm aware of, but if we have someone from Expo on, maybe they could give us a more insight into their testing philosophy. But one thing I like about Expo is that it's actually more. It's like a specialized browser is what Expo is. And so they totally control the environment. They know exactly how things are going to work, and they could totally make something that's more...
Cypress and Expo.
I like it.
Match made in heaven. Come on.
Robin calls it here. React Native comes with by the way, you should read the testing documentation on the React Native website. It's very good, and you should check it out. It kind of goes through a lot of different strategies and all the different tools. React Native comes out of the box with Jest, which is a test runner and test framework, mainly for unit tests, but it'll also run other types of tests. And we used to use Ava, which I think arguably has a nicer API than Jest. It's a pretty syntax and has a really nice feel to it. It's just really slow compared to Jest. That's the problem. Jest used to be slow, and then they rewrote the whole thing, and now it's like insanely fast.
Well, didn't we use Ava because it was faster than Jest?
Yeah, and because it feels nicer. Yeah. But Ava has kind of fallen behind in some ways. And so Jest because Jest is the default, it's just easier to go, okay, we're going to use Jest instead of Ava.
Ava has much less maintainers than Jest, so.
Yeah, exactly.
Jest has like the Facebook team, so.
Right. So with Jest, we just, there's normal matchers like expect something to be something else. But then you also have describe blocks and all of these things that we've come to expect from testing frameworks.
Come to expect.
That matches our expectations.
Uh-huh. There you go.
One of the things we do with Jest is component testing, specifically snapshot testing using the Storybook. I think it's called Story Shots.
Story Shots, yeah.
Story Shots. That's from Chromatic, I think is the company. So that's something where we can actually take a component and take a snapshot of its internals. Well, not really its internals, but like how it's set up, and then compare it to previous versions of that snapshot.
You pass it a bunch of props, and then you render it and take a snapshot of what rendered. And then if you change anything, it shows you a diff.
What's the benefit of that?
The biggest benefit is mostly just making sure that something you changed in a shared styles or shared theming or configuration doesn't affect things in your app that you're not expecting. It's just sort of a regression test, a quick smoke test, so that you are aware every time you make a commit what you're impacting throughout your app and whether it matches what you would expect.
I feel like snapshot testings are slightly controversial.
Why?
Would you agree with that?
Why do you think that?
I think some people think they're not useful.
Yeah, some people think they're not useful. I'm kind of one of them, to be honest.
I think if you have good end-to-end tests, it kind of defeats the purpose to have a snapshot test.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
in the case you don't have end-to-end tests, I think snapshot tests are pretty useful. And it's quite easy to set up.
That's basically why we use them. We use them because almost always, or in most of the projects I've been on, the client isn't willing to invest in end-to-end testing or doesn't have the time, doesn't have the budget, just it isn't a priority. And snapshot tests are a very inexpensive way for us to get some level of UI regression coverage.
I guess my criticism of snapshot tests is that often they become kind of background noise and you just update them and move on without really looking at what's going on. Now, maybe that's just my personality where...
Update, snapshot, move on.
Right, exactly.
That's a very valid criticism of them. I think that happens quite a lot. I know I'm guilty of that often.
Yeah.
But I still think for how little they cost, because our workflow involves using Storybook anyway. Most of the time we're building our components in a vacuum because we want them to be like pure or dumb.
Reusable,
I hate the term dumb components. I always cringe whenever I say dumb components. I'm like, it's not dumb. It's a piece of software I just built that I'm proud of. But like not relying on any context other than what props are passed to it. And that's how we build them using Storybook. And then Snapshot is just like, you could just add snapshot tests, like a couple config files, and it's like there. So it's very inexpensive to add them on top, and I don't see why we wouldn't.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Now, what I liked, it's semi-similar, but I think a little more useful, in my opinion, is visual regression testing. And what that is, and this was when we did native apps, we had a thing called motion juxtapose. What it would do is when you ran it, it would spin up a little Sinatra app, which is kind of like an Express app, but in Ruby. And you could load up localhost, 4040 or something, and it would pop up this page. And then you run your tests, and it would click through all of your screens and take a actual screenshot of it and compare those screenshots to previous screenshots you already had in the system. And you could have sort of a fudge factor, like it can change a little bit, maybe the time in the corner might change or whatever. And I believe there were even ways to kind of like block out sections. Don't compare this one spot because that's going to change every time. But it would check and see if like, hey, a button moved or, something got, moved around or the screen changed, or maybe there's an error and it pops up in that. And then what would happen is it would fail and you could just reload that web page and it would show you side by side the two screenshots, as well as a diff that would show in red the differences between the two screenshots. And then if it was like, no, I meant to do that, you just click a button, except it would delete the old screenshot and put the new screenshot in its place. When you commit it, in the pull request, it would literally show the new screenshot in the diff, in the GitHub diff. You would see the new screenshot of like, here's the old screenshot, here's the new screenshot. Like the image changed. And I meant to do that. Now, normally, like when we do a pull request, we'll often like screenshot what we did and just put it into the thing. But this was automatic. And this is a thing that would literally fail your test if it was different. I loved that. It was such high value. It was exactly what you're talking about. It was one line of code and you could snapshot. You'd just be like, hey, snapshot this screen, and then click, 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 snapshot again, click, 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 snapshot again. And it was like this amazing way to get huge confidence in your changes without writing a lot of code. I kind of feel like that is a better direction to go, but unfortunately, I haven't run across a very good way to do visual regression testing in React Native that is similar to motion juxtapose. Maybe there's something out there and I need to probably do a little more research on that, but that's something that I really wish existed. And Chromatic, I've talked with Chromatic, the company behind Storybook. They have this for web. and it works great. But they haven't invested in the React Native side, probably for the same reasons.
Yeah, it's a lot more difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So does it like compare pixel by pixel? Is that what you're trying to?
It does.
Okay.
It's using like probably image magic or something along those lines to check, and it'll actually generate an image with the diff, and it can tell you the percentage differences, and then you just kind of adjust that fudge factor. Once in a while you get a screen that would just like jump around for some reason, and that'd be really annoying.
Right.
Didn't actually happen in real life,
But I remember hearing a talk about exactly this at Chain React. Didn't someone talk about screenshot testing with React Native and Percy?
Yes. I remember that.
Yeah, Chain
I
React.
don't know. What's Chain React?
Chain React 2019. Carly Litchfield.
Okay.
I have.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I do remember that.
Yeah.
That's right. That was, and I
Yeah.
was gonna follow up and look over that whole thing, and I never did.
I actually looked at Percy, and I don't think they ever released it. I think that was just a proof of
Oh, that's
concept.
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
Yeah, when you Google it, you get Carly's talk. But
It says they do visual testing by detecting and reviewing visual UI changes. So that sounds very similar to what you were talking about.
yeah, but they
So
haven't. They haven't released anything I'm aware of for native. So, like officially.
It looks like this year Percy was purchased by Browser Stack, and maybe that had something to do with it. Changing their priorities or something like that.
Yeah.
But Percy is a service that does visual regression testing, probably very similar to Chromatic. Having the React Native side of it would be amazing. This is something that has been a little bit of a complaint that I think is valid about React Native, is that often you'll have all these cool tools that you wish you had in React Native, but they only work in a browser context. They don't work in React Native.
Right. Yeah.
feels like they should work because you're developing what feels like a web app, but a lot of your React tools don't work.
One thing that's not necessarily testing per se, but that sort of helps you achieve the same goals of having more confidence in your code before you ship it, is static analysis. There are different ways you can statically analyze code. Obviously, there are things like ESLint and Prettier, but one of the big ones that we use at Infinite Red is TypeScript. And TypeScript is, of course, its own kind of superset of JavaScript that double checks that what you are passing into different functions or different areas is what you intend to pass in. Like how do you see TypeScript kind of fitting into the testing strategy that you do?
I think using TypeScript can, in some cases, and this may be controversial, but in some cases it can kind of replace TDD. It's almost like not test-driven development, but type-driven development, because you're kind of defining what you want to see how like come out of a function or go into a function by just writing the types, and TypeScript is going to tell you whether that's happening as you expect or not. So I think it replaces some of that.
I think we just lost half our audience, Robin. Thanks a lot.
Sorry.
I don't use TypeScript, and I would definitely like to, use it in some project.
It's one of those things where if you haven't used it, or you've only done the tutorial or like a trivial example, it can seem like that's a lot of work,
Right, yeah.
not a lot of value. Like I already know how to write JavaScript. Why
Right.
not?
It kind of reminds me of like the older languages that I despise. So I'm like, do I?
Like Java.
Yeah.
We don't use strict mode, which I think Jamin's gotten into some controversial Twitter debates about strict mode. But especially if you're just learning TypeScript, you're new to it, turn strict mode off and put types in where it makes sense, and you can get practice like learning how to define them and how to use them. And if you don't want to put in types, don't put in types, and it will still work. It's just JavaScript. But once you're building an app, like in the middle of a project, like using it day in and day out, you start to really see how it reduces your cycles, because it'll catch all these little things before you even rebuild the app. Like just the other day, I was building it was just like a demo app because I was trying to repro a bug that I was going to file an issue on GitHub for. And I did just like a React Native init, and I forgot to use the TypeScript template. So it was just a JS React Native app. And I was literally just like putting a single button on a screen with like one other component. And I had to reload the app and go back and change my code like 4 times because of little like variable name differences and little things that TypeScript would have like caught immediately.
I definitely see the benefits here.
Yeah, I think outside of testing, it just makes you, in my opinion, much more productive developer. Maybe the first time you use it, you feel the pain, but it's crazy how little I have to refer to documentation when I use a TypeScript, like a library written in TypeScript. And I use it in my code. I can almost install it and just use it without reading documentation.
Start typing, it'll tell you what all the props are, like.
And a lot of times in VS Code, the actual example and documentation is right there. So, yeah.
Yeah, the TypeScript hints are really, really useful because it's like
amazing.
Documentation like right there in your code.
I like to kind of, and I understand like there are actually really, really good developers who disagree with me on this. So, your mileage may vary. I'm very happy that Robin agrees with me on this because she's a very good developer. But how I look at it is I actually agree with the critics who say I can write apps in JavaScript. I mean, I have for years. I've literally written JavaScript for 15 years.
Of course you can. Like, of course.
Yeah. Like it's totally doable. What I look at, but I'm also a TypeScript fan. So like people look at it like, wait, you're on this side, but you're also on that side. Like how are you? But how I look at it is TypeScript is a tool that helps me kind of, it's like a pair who's watching over my shoulder, a pair programmer who's watching over my shoulder.
Oh, you missed that.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh no, that one's supposed to be a number.
Exactly. And to me, I don't look at TypeScript as being a all-in language. Things like Elm or, Reason ML, those are languages that are designed from the ground up to have true type safety. But you can't really, it's getting better, but you can't really express everything that JavaScript can do in TypeScript. And some people will say, well, then don't write JavaScript that way. And okay, that's fair. But what I look at it as like, it is a helper for you. I'm going to write JavaScript. It's going to infer the types. Once in a while, I'll say it's useful to me to write an interface here or a type and type this, and then as I'm going, then it will know more about my program. But I'm not going to sit here and like satisfy this, this thing that is really like being very strict with me. And, I know what I'm doing. Like this is a string. You don't have to like whine about it. I can just tell it what to do and then we move on.
Hashtag whiny TypeScript.
Whiny TypeScript. But ultimately, like I was refactoring, not just refactoring, but literally rewriting Ignite CLI recently. And I didn't write any tests. I didn't do TDD. I just like started writing code. But it was in TypeScript. And I did 8 hours, literally 8 hours of rewriting the internals of Ignite CLI. And I would test manually. And I had TypeScript with very, like plenty of implicit any's and things like that where I needed. So the next day I came back and wrote some end-to-end tests. And in Node, it's a lot easier to write end-to-end tests. It's, pretty straightforward. And I found one bug in all the code that I wrote that was in a template file that TypeScript could not type check for me because it was EJS. So like the tests were great and it was important to write them, but ultimately the TypeScript stuff really did kind of help me have to, I didn't have to be writing tests for every single little thing. I didn't even have to write types for the most part. That was the cool thing. It was like it happened automatically for me. It's magical.
Yeah, TypeScript's implicit typing is actually very strong.
It is.
Yeah.
So have you noticed any slowness, like build or compile time? I'm guessing it's going to be a little slower than JavaScript, right?
I haven't really noticed anything.
Okay. A lot of times JavaScript has a build step anyway because you're going from modern JavaScript
the Babel has to do its thing.
To be honest, the build step for TypeScript is literally just going through looking for annotations and removing them.
Okay.
For the most part. I mean, you can translate too, but...
There's definitely slowness that I've noticed, but it's worth it. It's like just slowness in VS Code. Sometimes the TypeScript server just takes some time to, like, if I open a file, like, and I save it, it just takes a second for TypeScript to infer everything. And it gets compounded and worse if you have a monorepo. So in a monorepo scenario, I've had a lot of pains with TypeScript. But in a single repo, I've never, like, it's whatever slowness is really worth it.
We're working with a monorepo right now, and I almost always open each like package individually.
Yeah.
So we have like a mobile and a web, and I always open them in VS Code individually because VS Code seems to struggle less.
Yeah.
Because, and each one has their own separate TS config, so yeah, that just works better.
Yeah, I've definitely struggled with that. I've had TypeScript be so slow in a monorepo I've worked on as well. So yeah.
Static analysis is obviously, like I said, not really testing, but it can fill some of the voids that you might have with testing. Going with static type checking and testing, good test coverage can be a really great way to attack the problem from different angles and allows you to have, again, higher confidence in the code that you're shipping. There's a few other things with testing that we haven't really covered. For example, one of the big things is mocking. Mocking is where there might be another, system or component or service or something like that that is a dependency in the code that you're writing. The code needs it to do something, but it's not really the point of the code that you're trying to test. Like, it has its own tests, and there might be integration tests that also test it, the whole thing together, but you just want to test your thing. So Jest, I think, comes with its own ways to mock objects and includes and things like that, where you can just basically build an object that kind of looks like the other object. It has the same interface, but it doesn't really do anything. It just maybe tracks like, hey, I was called this many times with these arguments. And then you can check that later to make sure that happened. But you don't actually have to go and run that. There are some people that don't really like mocking tests. Like, they say that this is just a potential source of frustration because your mocks can get out of date or they can pretend to be working when they don't. They're basically, there can be a lot of issues with the integration side of it when you're doing mocks. It can also kind of hide subtle bugs like maybe timing issues or things like that. So that's another kind of part of this as well, testing with mocks.
Yeah, we always have to put in mocks for, I think it's just libraries that have native linking or native components, because when we run snapshot tests, it can't run the native layer. So I think because snapshots are in a different JavaScript context, right? They're more of a web style thing. Yeah, it's just testing the Node or something. The output, the JavaScript output, basically.
Gotcha.
So we have to mock things like React Native I18N and things like that your components might be using that just need to work and not use the native layer.
Yeah, when I started testing, mocking was definitely a huge obstacle for me when I first started. Like, I just didn't fully understand why we needed to do it. And then when I did, it's sort of like, it's kind of this obstacle where like you want to start testing, and then especially in React Native, and like there's all these things, libraries you have to mock. But sometimes some libraries, they actually provide us with the mocks, which I find really nice. They export their own mocks.
I think one of my favorite parts of testing is, it's kind of related to mocking, but it's like, what was the Ruby library? Faker, yeah. All the various like different ways that you can like make fake data. That's one of my favorite parts of testing, because you like come up with like crazy names for people and
yeah.
Mocking was something that threw me off too when I first started testing, and it was in Java. I was like, what's going on?
I just think mocking anything is just not very nice. Like, should you really mock people or test? Sorry, it's too easy of a joke.
Yeah, you stole it from Todd. Todd made that joke like a week ago.
Did I?
Yeah, I asked in the channel, an Infinite Red Slack channel, about mock. I was trying to mock a MobX stage read thing, and I asked if anyone knew how to mock it. And what did Todd say? He said, "I can mock anyone or anything. It's a skill of mine."
That's true, but I think he stole it from me because I tweeted about it back in May. So I have proof.
The saga of whose joke it was.
That's cool. I'll give Todd credit.
See, the difference
He's
is though
usually better at-
that you are saying it's not nice to mock people, and Todd is bragging about how he can mock anyone. So
if that doesn't encapsulate
that's
us.
the difference between Todd
Right.
and Jamin.
So I think that I feel like we could probably do a whole episode just on TypeScript because that really got
We already kind of did.
got us going. Yeah, we kind of did already, but I think this was fantastic to kind of explore the different types of testing and talk about our different experiences with testing. There's a lot more to talk about here. I would love to hear from people who are listening to this podcast, what they think about, testing frameworks and testing strategies with React Native. If there's anything new they've heard of, feel free to tag React Native Radio. That's with RDIO instead of RADIO at the end. On Twitter, we ran out of characters. We had to cut one. The A went. But I want to hear from people, and we'll probably revisit this topic in the future. There's just so much to go through with the testing side of things. Let's go into our weird bugs part of the podcast. Anybody have a weird bug that they want to talk about? I have one in case nobody else does, but I usually do. Okay. It's unfortunately an unsolved mystery. I wish I could tell you what was wrong, but this is the age-old works on my machine problem. As I've talked about before, I'm rewriting the internals of Ignite CLI, and I'm calling this Ignite Flame. That's the code name for this project, is the rewrite.
Stay tuned to Ignite on Twitter for more details.
Right. Yes, IR_Ignite, or just follow me because I probably tweet from there more. But the problem I ran into is Brian Stearns, who is one of our principal developers at Infinite Red. He started to test it and help me out with okay, is this going to work? And he spun up a regular React Native app just fine, worked great. And then he went to spin up the Expo version because Ignite Flame can do either Expo or regular. And he came back and said, I'm running into this error. It's just popping up this error. And the error was, please hold. I'm actually going to go look it up real quick.
Your call is very important to us. Please stay on the line.
The error was, it came through failed to exec prepare script, npm run all patch, and then some arguments. So it was running this prepare yarn prepare script. And first off, we couldn't really figure out why it was running yarn prepare, why it was trying to do this. Secondly, why was it failing? Because it should work. And thirdly, why is it working on my machine and not Brian's? So we had someone else on our team, Darren, another principal dev. He went through the process to spin it up on his. He actually ended up with the same problem. So the only machine it was working on was my machine. So there's this binary called npm run all, which allows you to run a bunch of different scripts all at once. And I checked, and no, it wasn't installed globally. It wasn't that was a difference in our environment. We tried using env-info by Trevor Brindle, which kind of gives you a good snapshot of your environment to see what the differences was. It was hard to really tell. We tried using Solidarity by Gantt to try to figure out environment differences. Could not figure this out. Eventually, we just went into the package JSON for the boilerplate that we were spinning up, removed the prepare script, and then added it back in after we had spun up the app. Okay, we're going to go ahead and add this as a line in the package JSON after we're done. So it was basically just a workaround. We don't know why this is running. We don't know why it's failing. We're just going to remove it, wait until everything's done, put it back in. Once you yarned, once you actually pulled in all of the dependencies, then it worked fine. So that was the cool thing. But it wouldn't work when you were trying to just generate the boilerplate. So environment differences can be really frustrating, and it's kind of problematic. But we just have a little bit of code in there that works around the problem.
So ultimately, we don't know why this happened, right?
No idea.
We may never know.
I feel like this has happened so many times to me too. It doesn't work. I don't know why it didn't work, and it works now. So yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad that we found this before someone just filed an issue and was like, "Was this?" But I guess just doing the doing the workaround works. You know, sometimes that's just the best way to do it. It bugs me that I don't know the reason why this failed, but do the workaround, move on.
Interesting.
Very cool. Well, I think that's it for this episode of testing strategies, tools, and frameworks. Really happy everybody came along for the ride to listen to us riff on this. As always, you can find us on Twitter at React Native RDIO. Harris, where can people find you on Twitter?
They can find me at Brunostman, which is BRUNOSTMANN.
Aditi, where can they find you?
They can find me at Aditi Ravi on Twitter. And I'd also like to give a quote on quality by Aristotle, which says, "Quality is not an act, and it's a habit." So I think that applies to us as software developers too. So hopefully, our listeners can get a little bit of inspiration to test.
I kind of want to like cross stitch that and frame it and put it in my
That's fantastic.
on my wall.
I had this
That's
on my
awesome.
course. I'm like, might as well.
That's great. I love
Very
it.
appropriate.
Robin, where can people find you?
I'm at Robin_Hines, and that's with an E at the end.
And you can find me at Jamin Holmgren, my first and last name, on Twitter. And we will see you all next time. Again, this episode was brought to you by Infinite Red. Check us out, infinite.red. See you all next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.